This episode is dedicated to Jonathan Johnson, Pulver, Ray Friedman, and Cesar Alvarez Jr., for becoming our newest Southpaw supporters, and helping to make this project possible.
This is Sam.
This is Dan.
This is Jason.
And this is Fight Study.
Today we have a very special fight study. We have MMA analyst Dan Tom, and we have MMA coach Jason Sargus to talk to us about UFC 266. But before we get to that, on the same day as UFC 266, we had undisputed cruiserweight boxing champion Oleksandr Usyk defeating unified heavyweight champion Anthony Joshua to become a two-division unified champion, one of only three. Jason, I know you caught this one. Tell us your impressions of the fight.
Well, I thought it was going to be an interesting matchup from the jump. And what I'm not sure, I mean, everyone should realize this, but they didn't even state it in the commentary, which was a little bizarre. Usyk was trained by Lomachenko's father early in his amateur career. So if you notice some of the Lomachenko footwork that you saw in the Anthony Joshua fight, I mean, that comes, I mean, they're both Ukrainian, obviously, Loma and Usyk, but they've both worked extensively with Anatoly Lomachenko. And, everyone knows Vasily Lomachenko's style. And there was a little bit of that. I mean, not even a little bit, a significant amount of it in this fight against Joshua.
Both southpaws too.
Yeah, both fight with the right hand lead. Both southpaws. Both have that little step pivot shift to set up that outside angle. And I really thought AJ, Anthony Joshua, doesn't get enough credit for being an incredibly fundamentally sound heavyweight. Because he gets, he gets shit on a little bit because of how much muscle he carries. They talk about what a genetic outlier and physical outlier he is. I mean, he's big, he's strong, he's fast. He has all the physical tools. And sometimes I think they like to just lump him in and define him based solely on his physical attributes, when really he's an excellent heavyweight. And he's shown it time and time again. He can box. He's fundamentally sound. He's big. He's strong. He's fast. And for a big man carrying that much muscle, he does a very good job of like measuring his cardio and anaerobic output so as not to gas, though he has in the past. But that's sort of what you get. Someone that size is a different lactic acid threshold and different glycogen consumption and different physiological needs than someone who's not carrying that kind of muscle.
And did you think that Usyk would take this one?
No, I really didn't. I thought given the punching power and his ability to find that shot, that AJ would have found it eventually. And early in the fight, he just missed. If you see some of those right hands, and this is a credit to Usyk's defense and vision on the inside, some of those just missed, and they were nice, straight, well-timed shots that they just missed. And I think if any of those land early, seeing in the later rounds, like what was it, the eighth round? I think was the seventh or the eighth round was AJ's best round. I think coming after a really good round for Usyk in round 7, and that in that eighth round he found that nice tight right hand that he just kind of threw out there straight, a little shoulder rotation, and not a lot on it, but it stunned him. And then later in that round, after throwing that nice tight right hand that split the guard, he threw one that started the same but just looped around, and he was able to change that trajectory because he didn't overcommit to the shot. He didn't put too much behind it, but he punched around Usyk's guard and landed another right hand. But because he had to take some of the steam off of it, one for greater accuracy, and two, I mean, we're in the second half of the fight, and cardio being what it was, started to play some role in that decision making. But after that rounds 9, 10, 11, and 12, you saw Usyk start to pull away. And I thought by round 8 or round 9, AJ would have found one of those big shots. And when he didn't, after his best round in round 8, I didn't figure it was coming afterwards.
Real quick, Jason is so much better at describing the body cardio thing than how Rogan does it. You know, like if Rogan could just like even do some semblance of what Jason just did, I feel like he wouldn't get as much crap. I think it'd be much more realistic to the broadcast. You know, like I've never heard it explained so well for what that's worth.
I appreciate that. But different muscle systems and different body types require, have different energy consumption, and we're not all built the same. And since we are governed by some drug testing criteria, we can't just throw as many steroids at the wall and say, none of us are meeting our genetic potential, like Joe and company do whenever they can just sort of dabble in performance enhancing drugs. So
right.
The certain guys in drug tested sports are sort of, at least to some extent, chastened by their genetics.
Having watched it now, do you think Usyk was having the fight of his life, or do you think it was more about Usyk being a tough matchup against Joshua?
I think like those aren't mutually exclusive possibilities. I mean, I think Usyk fought an incredible fight. He really did. He came in with a good game plan, and I thought AJ was looking really sharp, given the movement that he had to contend with from Usyk. Usyk started out with an excellent game plan. He was lead hand checking AJ's jab hand, and that's good for him. Knowing that Joshua's the bigger fighter with the bigger puncher, you get to do two things whenever you start playing that little hand check game, maybe even three. It's a good rhythm disruptor, and it serves not only to hide like that Loma style footwork to make that outside angle, but it also keeps AJ's right hand at a longer distance. Establishing this early is incredibly important because it proves to be an excellent strategy throughout the first half of the fight. It occupied AJ's lead hand, took away the setups for his right hand. So there was minimal explosive offense coming from AJ's power side early in that fight, where he's most dangerous. That being said, AJ started to take his foot off the gas, not in a bad way. He didn't punch himself out of position, which was inspired thinking. He didn't overcommit, but at the same time, the brilliance of Usyk's game plan is neither did he. Being the smaller fighter and he had to break down that distance, he didn't overcommit to do so. He did it cleanly, staying defensively responsible while scoring quite a bit. So I thought it was some game planning mastery from Usyk and probably his camp and coaching staff. Some excellent counter game planning from Joshua in his camp, but Usyk's footwork and his ability to continue that over 12 rounds and avoid any big shots. I mean, he got hit with some, but they weren't super clean. I think that's the difference maker.
All right, let's get into it. UFC 266, probably one of the few cards people were excited about this year. And from the prelims to the main card, it delivered mostly. Let's start with the main event. Alexander Volkanovski defeated Brian Ortega to retain his featherweight title in a lopsided decision. This was Volkanovski's second title defense and first title fight that wasn't Max Holloway, which gave us a look at what it looks like when it's not Holloway. This was Ortega's second title fight, which in my opinion was weird because he lost to Holloway soundly and in 3 years only had one other fight, the Korean Zombie. And after that one fight, he was already back at a title shot. So it's not just about whether he deserved it or not, but maybe he needed some other fights in between. because now you have him in a situation where he's lost 2 title fights badly in 3 fights. Let's start with you, Dan. What were your thoughts going into this fight as far as how their styles matched up, followed by your thoughts about both their performances?
In a basic way, going in, I thought their style dynamic was pretty much, you had the dynamic finisher in Ortega, whereas the champion Volkanovski, you had more of a technically layered game, a more process-driven fighter, more strategy, adaptations and whatnot. So it was how well could he control and navigate in his desired path without falling into the potential pitfalls on the feet in transition or on the floor with Ortega. We essentially saw that dynamic play out. We saw Ortega try to take some of the tools, I think, early with some of the, trying to do some checking jabs of his own, some strong leg kicks, although they were more to the thigh, whereas Volkanovski, following the trend of today, more to the calf. So we got to see a lot of these dynamics play out. And the striking to even the scares in round 3, which I'm sure we'll get to, none of that necessarily surprised me that they happen or that Volkanovski survived them. I did pick him officially by decision. So with the outcome, I guess I can't say that I was surprised. I just more kind of came to a realization of the point you mentioned, Sam, as far as this is what we rushed this kid Ortega into, and I kind of had more of those questions leaving with it.
Jason, what did you think going into this fight? And really, what did you think about Ortega's performance as far as, did he fight a bad fight, or this was like actually him fighting really well? Volkanovski was just that much better.
I think that's a great question. I think you can't take anything away from Volkanovski's performance. His ability to find power shots, especially that right hand, to go for, I believe Dan just described it as like layered offensive strategy. That gives you, because he's not spamming wild things. It becomes a little bit less, I don't want to say noticeable, but a little more nuanced, that he's able to put the pieces together as he wants to get the fight to unfold as he hopes it will. And when you start to see that, if you start to watch some of his other fights, you see that happen time and time again, and it's sort of a process to it. I thought that Ortega made it difficult for him to do that at times, but because he couldn't completely take that away, the damage started to accumulate. And credit to Ortega, he can take a shot, and he's as game as they come. I just don't think because he's as game as they come, I don't think you give him an extra 45 seconds to a minute and a half in between rounds to be that game, right? Whatever fuckery was afoot there, we can discuss later. But it was Volkanovski doing what he does well. And if you thought that he was disrupted a little bit, that's because Ortega's a good fighter. But he's got some vulnerabilities against the elite. And, you show me a guy that we all know can take a punch, I'll show you a guy that's taken a lot of punches. And that's sort of how Ortega has begun to be defined, at least when he gets to the higher levels of this game. And there's no higher level than a world title fight in the UFC at this point.
Watching Volkanovski's performance in this fight, any concerns about his chin?
For me, no, none. I think he was, like I said, he fights like he has a helmet on. I mean, he can take a punch. He really can. He shifts and moves in a way that he doesn't necessarily get hit flush all the time, but he takes enough offensive chances, and he's got like a kick heavy attack where he can get countered once in a while. But I think his chin is incredibly durable.
What did you think about Volkanovski staying in his guard even after the close submissions? And how do you think he survived that?
Wow. It's like the normal impulse and response from the human brain to avoid danger doesn't really exist in Volkanovski's head. And I don't think it's really fair that he gets the criticism he does because he is like layered in his approach to breaking down elite opponents. He gets shit on a little bit. So it doesn't mean that he can't fight like his hair is on fire when he wants to or when he has to, and he can certainly bring it when he wants to bring it. Um, do I think that was a great idea? Absolutely not. I think it would have been in his best interest to keep the fight standing. But as soon as I said that, and I think I was about to text that to you and I deleted it, he starts blasting him with ground and pound and turns what was a back and forth round into a potential 10-8 round. So he sort of defies logic, and like my normal coaching response would have been to stay out of his guard, stay out of his guard. What are you doing? And then it would have made me look silly, and I'd have been taking it back immediately after I said it.
He did credit his cardio for how he survived those submission attempts. Do you think having really good cardio can help you survive choke attempts in particular? I think if it was an arm bar, what's cardio going to do for you, right? But for chokes, do you think it helps?
I don't know the science behind it, but I imagine that there's something to the fighter brain engaged in fight or flight scenarios that says, hey, our oxygen needs and oxygen consumption being what it is, we're fine here for a little bit. Whereas like me, I've got asthma and bad lungs, and I think I can fight through anything, but next thing I know, I'm snoring. Right? But so I think there might be something to that, but I'm not sure of the science behind it.
I know city kickboxing people have recently incorporated underwater training where they go underwater, hold their breath, and do a lot of breathing exercises to be able to hold their breath for a long time. So I wonder if some of that has helped too.
I believe that there might be some merit to that. I mean, I wouldn't buy the Boss Rutan breathing device or a training mask ever, but there might be some merit to that.
The people who wear those masks for exercise won't wear a mask for any other reason, even in a pandemic. So there's some irony there.
It's absolutely amazing. I mean, we can get to that. I can't work out with that thing on. But you are working out with a worse version of that intentionally, and we can go in depth on why that won't work, like why that mask doesn't work. I don't think it does anything except maybe exercise the lungs a little bit. But if you think that that's going to add any like adaptive mechanism of greater red blood cell production, you're out of your mind, because that's not how that shit works. It's just not.
That got debunked like 10 years ago when Wanderlei Silva was doing something similar. So
yeah, it didn't have a snorkel.
yeah, and it was like duct tape, so he couldn't tear it off even if he wanted to. So he was forced to train in that.
Oh man,
that looked miserable.
Dan, do you think Ortega burned himself out, or maybe had an adrenaline dump after the near submissions?
Absolutely. Him having crazy third rounds is not obscure by any means. If you look at his sample size, he's very much like a Yoel Romero in that aspect. Again, a dynamic, opportunistic finisher. A lot of similarities there from that regard. Obviously, different styles of fighter there. It wasn't surprising that he had that, but I do believe, and it parlays into the conversation you guys just had about cardio, is that like Jason, I'm sure there's some scientific and some stuff during, before, and that helps those fight or flight mechanisms. Undeniably, especially if you're honest about your mental status, even if you're just a grappler listening to this, your mind will dictate a lot of what happens in there, right? That being said, there's nothing like good old technique, and I also believe that inherently it shouldn't matter as much, because in those situations, I'll quote the late great Robert Follis. He would call it whenever a fighter puts down the pack, you feel them exhale and get tired. And almost everybody does that, whether you're a high-level fighter or like average Joe in your grappling evening class, is when they get something like a triangle especially, and they will just kind of burn out on it. And someone posted a clip of Volkanovski using that same elbow to C-clamp to the inside thigh frame as just like a survival frame while he was inside a triangle. And he's trying to talk while he's in it, and he's saying, it's okay, I'm going to let him burn himself out. And I saw people poking fun at that, but that's actually like a legitimate I couldn't think of the old school mid-aught Brazilian gi grappler, Brazilian guy with a beard most of the time in footage, really mangled ears, but his whole game was like, I'm going to let you triangle me because my defense is so good. And the type of passes and opportunities when you break that, are so plentiful because back to Fallis's quote, you feel your opponent almost proverbially put down the pack. So assuming you have generally good defense and at least good enough to have survived to that point, I think inherently you should already be at a cardio advantage. And that's when you should be hitting the gas. And that's when I would do it as a very unathletic, not good martial arts practitioner. And I would find most of my successes at those points. So even though it seemed kind of crazy that Volkanovski was going into it, I think he felt the answer to your question, Sam, which is why he went to it. And on that note, very few fighters, I don't know, I think fighters make questionable decisions all the time in and out of the cage. That's not what I want to say, but very few fighters do it in a stylistic way and put you in awe. Like, I think my earliest memories are probably like the Randy Couture's when he was doing outlying stuff. Then you've got GSP in certain style matchups where you're like, is he really going to out wrestle the wrestler? What? Right? And this is kind of like how I initially thought Chandler versus Oliveira was going to play out, which is why I picked Chandler, because Chandler has a lot of that same attitude Volkanovski does and has the, submission defense to kind of back that up. The chin, maybe not so much in Chandler's case, whereas I agree with Jason's take on Volkanovski's chin. So seeing him embrace all those tools and go right back into the belly of the beast was very inspiring. I don't want to overdo it here and make any like Michael Jordan parallels, but we don't have any of these real parallels in the sport. And very few guys can just awe me in that stylistic way like Volkanovski did.
And anybody who's grappled, if you put somebody in a rear naked choke, even if they get out, your arms don't really burn out. But the two submissions where you will burn out is the guillotine choke, especially when the arm is in, and the triangle choke.
Yep.
And so he went for those back to back. And those are the most energy intensive ways to choke somebody. So I believe he had a really hard time getting up after that round. And I think it wasn't just because he was getting beat up, but also he was burned out.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right there, Sam. There's a massive energy expenditure in both of those, especially if you're the dynamic finisher that is fully committed to it, like Ortega is, and he went to both. And both he, especially the guillotine, he tends to finish, right? So there is also that thought of, I don't have to pace myself. If I go all in on this, I am out of here. And I'm gonna steal the show with this. And he's in it 100%. He's all in. Doesn't get it. Gets a second opportunity. 100% all in. And that's why, I don't like the extra time that he got. But people saying that because he didn't just sprint back to the corner or jump right up, that he didn't answer the bell, have no idea what it is like to be that physically fatigued. So I think there's some of that combined with, like, he didn't quit like the average human being, or even a very good fighter normally would have. The beating he took after being so exhausted was pretty impressive. Both having dished out, and credit to Volkanovski, and it was still as impressive having seen a human being endure it. So if he wants to take another second or two before he goes back to his corner, hey, fine by me. I don't like the ref asking him 17 times and showing him just one finger point blank to his nose. How many do I have up? But everything else, I'm fine with.
Now, Dan, after the zombie fight, the UFC commentators were saying this was a new Ortega. Volkanovski said it's the same Ortega, and he just looked like that because zombie is flat-footed. Do you think this was a different Ortega than the one that fought Holloway?
It was. I feel like many things, it's kind of a sum of both parts. The truth lies in the middle. I think, to Ortega's own admission, it was a different Ortega in the zombie fight, because he simply did things like wrestled and attached kicks and things. Again, Ortega admitted himself he just didn't do. So it really didn't take much to, bolt on to the proverbial ship to make it look like a different sailing vessel. He goes out, switches his stance, even though he always switched stance, but he primarily fought from a southpaw stance, which we saw him do against Volkanovski. But to Volkanovski's credit, I also agree with him, because it wasn't and I use the word layered. Ortega's wasn't layered. As somebody who fights from southpaw, primarily, it was real easy to see that it was pretty much all checking shots from the right side, the lead side, and it was setting up opportunistic power from the rear. And that was good. That was smart outfighting that you needed to do against a guy like Korean Zombie who has pocket counters that'll just make you pay. And then sure, the spinning elbow definitely helped send the fight in his trajectory, which was deceptively more competitive when you go back and watch it. But again, to Volkanovski's point, without it being layered, we saw Volkanovski, surprise, surprise, was very prepared. He used a lot of the hand fighting, which I really enjoyed in Jason's breakdown of the Joshua Usyk fight. But we saw that here again with whether they were southpaw versus southpaw or open stance pairing. Volkanovski really, abuses him on the hand fighting. He has kicks from both, no matter the stance pairing, which he showed in the Max fight. And Ortega, oddly enough, had his most success we saw in that round 5, bringing back stuff he did from round 1, which was the checking jabs and right hands and leg kicks set up from an orthodox stance, not his newly evolved Ortega air quotes from the southpaw stance. So again, I actually agree with both. I think there's truth in what both parties are saying there in regards to what was this a new Ortega or not.
The one point I would make is that I like the Korean Zombie. I think he's probably one of the most entertaining fighters in the UFC, but it's tough to compare a Korean Zombie to a Max Holloway. They bring so many different things in direct opposition to one another to the table that when trying to use Ortega as your constant and make some sort of determination, it's tough. It's like he's fast on a 3-mile course, or is he fast on a 12-mile course with hills? And what's his mile time on each? Well, the variables are so different from one to the other that it's tough to say. I agree with what Dan said, especially about the switching to a conventional stance. I made note of that when I was watching the fight. He's fighting better this round from the orthodox position, and I'm not sure. I haven't looked or put together any film study on how Volkanovski does against southpaws, but he seemed to be eating up Ortega when Ortega was in the southpaw stance, because Ortega got hit with that right hand a lot. Yeah, I don't really have much else to say given the really thorough and what I would say spot on breakdown from Dan.
Too kind, man. Too kind.
No problem at all. I just embarrassed myself trying to trump you.
Hey, Sam, can I interject? I don't want to derail you, but I'm just really curious with Jason's opinion, not just because I respect his analysis, but he's got much more experience from the coaching and cornering perspective. And I know I was a bit harsh on kind of it's not just the corner, it's the ref, it's the officiating. If you've got any issues with a fight being stopped or not stopped, I feel like one of the 3 parties gets overly maybe holds the bag too much there. So I definitely don't want to do that. But I know I definitely had issues with a lot of the stuff I saw in the corner, not just from the stoppage, but from the stuff like Tiki saying this is what's called earning it after the 4th round, which would have been the 2nd or 3rd time they had the chance to stop the fight, depending on your perspective. And then the putting like water. If you go back and watch in that 4th round, Brian's trying to get his breath reset, and they're putting like a full bottle of water in his face to where like it shoots up into his nostrils and eyes. And
I saw that.
It just seemed like an amateur shit show. I know, like, hey, we all do stupid things, stress under duress, even the corner is not the fighter. So I don't want to condemn someone off one sample, one fight, but they just failed a lot of checkpoints to the fact that at that point of the fight, I was like, I can't cut these guys slack. I got to get a real coach and corner's opinion here, Jason.
No slack whatsoever should be cut. It was a fucking F-. All right, it was abysmal. The number one, you don't speak in cliches as if some sort of Mickey to Rocky speech is going to allow your fighter to flip that switch after the concussive trauma they've just fucking endured. It almost sounds like they have pre-scripted one-liners so that they can sound cool on the broadcast. And I got news for everybody. The whole punch a hole in his fucking chest from Ray Longo has already been done. And it was silly then, and trying to reinvent it is silly now. So if you're not going to come at your fighter with some true technical advice, then, and your fighter is seemingly lost, if you looked into Ortega's eyes when he did do that spit thing into the, because I saw it, like you said, and I made note of it too. There is no, "Are you okay? How do you feel?" And at that point, I was reminded of a quote from my boxing coach, Billy Briscoe, who said, "It's really fucking easy to be brave with another man's blood." They failed their fighter and allowed a fighter who is still young and still has championship ability to go out. What was, you don't want to say, "Hey, what's the setup to our blast double?" You're just going to call out for a blast double against a guy who's not an explosive wrestler type. What are you talking about? What are you saying? And I thought it was shit from top to bottom. And I was a little bit disappointed in the human race that day.
One of the problems Ortega talked about was chaos with his camp. It was like too many people trying to take charge and it wasn't organized correctly. So he had to get rid of people, blah, blah, blah. But I kind of wondered if that happened again.
I'm surprised there's any oxygen left in the fucking arena with the amount of oxygen that the egomaniacs in the fucking corner were trying to eat up. And at that point, it didn't seem like there was legitimate concern. It just seemed like it was their moment, almost like they were relishing the break in between rounds because they knew a camera would be on them. And maybe I'm being too harsh, but that's how it appeared to me, as opposed to, "How do you feel? You just got bludgeoned. How do you feel? There's nothing. You got to dig deep. This is where we earn it." Earn what? And just because he can tell you what number it is, I don't think he could remember what fucking day it was. How about you try to see if your fighter is there? There wasn't even any of the Greg Jackson, like, "Let's just breathe and recover, breathe and recover." It's almost like a failure to even acknowledge that he took that beating. Again, you can't just change the narrative because you want it to be so, as if somehow that's going to inspire your fighter. Yeah, sometimes you want to poker face things a little bit and give them your analysis and advice in the moment, to try to be, as measured and clinical as possible. But at the same time, like, these hype speeches, when you have a compromised fighter, I mean, do you know nothing of human physiology? Do you know nothing of human neurology? Do you know nothing of the brain's response to physical trauma? It's a silly and ignorant approach to cornering that is like cliched from bad fucking fighter films. Sorry about that, guys. Sorry.
No, totally. I totally co-sign. And I kind of struggled to answer for a second and felt bad for a guy who prides himself on his attention to detail. But the truth is, to both your guys' points, it was chaos in the corners. To the again, by Ortega's own admission, just like he admitted that he was glad the doctor saved him, which no one saved him in this fight. By his own admission, there was chaos in his corners. And if you look at it, there is no set guy. Like, the most set presence who wasn't there is, Henner, a guy who's, no offense, I feel like his base is brand selling before jiu-jitsu, and then who knows what, and that's your head corner. I don't, he's great at selling a brand, but you don't, and you have a great brand, Ortega, but this is a fight. And to, Jason, I don't think your criticism's too harsh there, because that's kind of my general criticism from the corner to even the officials who stand on the side in the suits, which I was saying on my podcast, I don't think people realize, which is why, like, the Greg Hardy and Haler gate is so ridiculous, is that, like, those officials, they're not supposed to be just standing there looking pretty and tough for the camera. Like, they actually have to enforce, again, the whole reason why the corners officials, the whole reason why they're there is to facilitate, protect, and allow the fighter to safely do their job, right? I'm pretty sure that's essentially the base point of all the jobs, the point of common thread that we should all be able to see eye to eye on. And it's just disgusting when Jason said, it's like, is the fighter even being looked after? I mean, the corner's not looking after him. And that was something I watched, is that they don't even ask if he's okay. And correct me if I'm wrong, Jason, but yes, you want your fighter to breathe, which is something else they fail to do. But, like, those quick beats in communication when you first get in, before those before granted, the guys in the jacket, the commission people don't do shit. They don't do their job, but still, you don't want to communicate certain things around them, because if they hear, they can report it to the doctor, who is usually not far behind you, especially in a really bad round like Ortega had. So even me as a novice, inexperienced cornerman, I would know I have that key beat to say, hey man, are you okay? And get that key information before you can decide to play poker game and say, yeah, he's fine, his knee's fine, or whatever the physical issue is with your fighter. If you want to play that game, right? I don't know.
Yeah, I think to get that response from the corner, you would have to actually care in that moment about your fighter's well-being above the promotion's best interest and the entertainment value of the fight, and whatever percentage they may be getting paid. If there is like any chance that they could pull off an upset, I mean, again, it is another man's blood that they're in there playing with. And I see things a little bit differently. I've made dog shit money from any fighter I've ever coached. So their well-being, number one, is their well-being, and it's tied with the win. Because I'm always of the mindset that if you tend to dominate, you tend not to get hurt as badly. So you come in there prepared, you control the things you can't control, and you come in great shape. But that being said, if your fighter is taking a substantial beating, I'll ask him in front of the ref. That way, if he answers truthfully, or the ref or the ringside physician hears it and they stop it, then it's not on me. It's not on the fighter. I haven't had to call a fight like that because my guys very seldom get. I mean, I cornered the Frivola fight in the UFC, and he got starched in a minute by Polo Reyes, so there wasn't really a chance to do anything. And I think that's my sole entry into the UFC under the UFC banner. But PFL, I was in there with Eddie Truck Gordon, and we were getting pieced up by a tough Russian with a jab, but there's no real fear. But I had another fighter who got his head smashed in, literally a golf ball sized dent in his forehead from a knee, and he bounced right back up. And if you wanted to go, I wouldn't have let him. You talk about not performing well under duress. When I saw that hole, and then the doctor was talking to him after they stopped the fight very quickly, as they should have. It didn't register to me that this man in a sweater was a doctor. He didn't seem like a doctor to me, and I was in panic mode because I saw a hole in my fighter's forehead.
Oh man.
I wonder if Ortega had a hole in his forehead, which he may have. It just might have swollen over and no one noticed. But I wonder if any of those assholes in the corner, and yeah, they're more successful than me and they have better fighters than me. They probably beat me up. Some of them maybe not. But I wonder if they would have stopped the fight if he did, or they would have let him go out on his fucking shield. Well, how about you don't let your fighter go out at all? I mean, you can do that. That's part of being a coach and managing a fighter. You manage their safety.
That's why I was kind of surprised by Tiki Gozin being the main voice there, because if he's the manager and also the coach, it's doubly more in his financial incentive to keep this fight going, right? And there's been a lot written about how a lot of managers in the UFC are not looking out for the best interest of their fighters. Nick Diaz having a similar situation, which we'll get into. But let me ask you this, Dan. Were you surprised that Henry Gracie didn't stop the fight? Because he says that's like his brother. He considers him a family member. I was like, okay, clearly Henry Gracie is going to protect his brother, his family member, his childhood friend, and stop the fight. And then I kept waiting and it didn't happen. So Dan, were you surprised at all?
Obviously, I took some Gracie shots there earlier, but honestly, if anything, I'll speak in his defense here. Like if there's anyone that had that humanity in them, I do believe that it was Henner. If you go back to the Max fight, they cut away from the camera, but he's doing guys, and we all know how that is from grade school to when adults are drunk and out of hand. That guys, when people are talking, they're not focusing on what needs to be focused on. And it was followed by get the doctor. So that tells me he was the one that actually cared. So in his defense, like that's why I was citing, like, where's Henner? Not that Henner is some end all be all, like the best guy to have in your corner, but for what was needed at that point, again, he wasn't there. So I don't even know if Henner was even in the corner, because to Jason's point, everyone was so hungry to get their voice out. There was no handing of the baton. There was no sequencing like you'll see in other good corners where they go, all right, what do you got, coach? And it's, there was none of that. So
Henner was there behind the cage. He was kind of yelling through the cage, trying to give him, I don't know what kind of notes or encouragement, while like there was another person on the other side of the cage doing the same thing. And then two people beside Ortega doing the same thing. And then Tiki right in front of his face, also giving him Rocky cliches.
I'll just add really quick that you said it's doubly bad for a manager to be there. I'll say it's triply bad in MMA, because yes, the managers are essentially just using these guys as trading cards, to get the bigger guys in, or selling, smaller guys to put over bigger guys in hopes that they can get certain matchups. And you see it from their tweets that are in lockstep with the promotion. And that even extends to a third leg, sadly, even into my own realm, where you see a lot of journalists, as well towing that line. So yeah, it's super problematic for that position. Go ahead, Jason.
Oh, I think you're spot on. It's a vertically integrated, like ancestral, not ancestral, symbiotic relationship between management, promotion, and now even some of these gyms, like the relationship that the gyms have. And when you don't have any separation, there is no bargaining power. When there's no bargaining power, there's too much promotional control. When there's too much promotional control, especially in a monopoly like the UFC, then the fighters are at a significant disadvantage. And if you're being cornered by your manager, and your manager wants your stock to go up, he doesn't want to see you quit on the stool, even if that saves you from CTE or from potential brain trauma or any other trauma for that matter. He doesn't want to see that. He doesn't want, his value in you is based on your stock value to the promotion. The higher he can grow that, the better it is for him. And wanting to do that to your detriment when you are in the midst of battle is a problem. There's an immense conflict of interest, and going back to like the multiple voices in the corner. Like, I've heard multiple voices in the corner when they were cohesive and organized and had a singular message to the benefit of the fighter. This was disjointed. It seemed, as you said, Dan, everyone wanted to get their 15 seconds of glory or fame by having a cliched one-liner or saying something cool as opposed to something valuable. Like, even just, how do you feel? Like, yeah, that's more of a greeting card moment rather than like a fight highlight moment. But I think it would have been incredibly important to ask your fighter who had been getting bludgeoned, especially after that third round, those things.
To add context to this, there are a lot of times for an MMA fighter, because there's not a lot of pay, where maybe their trainer is also their manager. But situations like that, you got like two people or maybe three people at the corner, where you have the head coach / manager in the corner. And then the two other people are like the assistants, who are also just like other fighters or just people from their gym that the head trainer needed their help with carrying some of the stuff. So when you just have a small ensemble, then it makes sense that the head coach is everything. But Ortega had like a whole team of highly paid people, right? And it didn't seem clear who was in charge of it. So this is a different situation where it's like he had 5 different coaches for 5 different arts. And I remember in the countdown, it didn't show Tiki as the head coach. It showed somebody else. But then all of a sudden, the manager is acting as the head coach. That's why this stuck out, is because this wasn't a small operation where you might see that, where it's appropriate, where the head trainer is also the manager just by default, because they're just a small team right now and the fighter is just starting to work their way up. Whereas with Ortega, it didn't make sense. And my gut feeling was in round 1, it wasn't like this, but by round 2, and especially after round 3, it became like this. The more they felt like they were losing this fight, the more it became chaotic. And I think a good camp when you're in a bad situation, they keep it together. And if anything, they shine in those moments. Whereas they were just falling apart. So it was like a camp that's kind of like front runners where they're good when they're doing good and they do even worse when they're doing bad.
Yep. And can I just add one thing that as far as egos go, the ironic part is the ego problem should have been in Volkanovski's corner on paper. You've got Eugene Behrman, who is, all this credit and acclaim, which I'm not hating on. I just always get upset that his other coach in the corner, George Lopez, who has been Volkanovski's main coach the whole time, like never gets a shout, which is why I'm glad Anik made it a point to do that. And then you either have Brad Riddell, who's usually in his corner, an active fighter, though this time I think it was Jamie Malarkey, his Australian freestyle MMA training partner. So again, fighters/active fighters. I'm sure there's no ego there. So you have all these big egos, right? And look how cohesive they were.
Yeah.
So it's not even an excuse. So it really shows unhealthy egos really just telling themselves. And especially when, his people, have no right to be bumping their chest. And to your point, Sam, you're right. It was a different person in the countdown. So when, you get in live fire situations, which is why they always say train under duress for, from military to firearm instruction and stuff like that. Like, well, if the fighter doesn't know who the head coach is, how are the other coaches going to know who to defer to, right? Like, for example, I'll throw John Crouch in there. He's kind of popping up. Regardless what feelings, or I know that they had a split with their fighters, but I do like how, I'm not there. I only can judge from the outside, but I like how Crouch runs his corner, and it seems like he gets that respect from his and gives his other guys respect. If there's another coach, fighter there, he'll call him coach and give them their time to give advice and whatnot. And there's like a healthy flow. And yeah, none of that before Taker's corner.
A note to our loyal listeners: if you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. This will give you access to exclusive bonus content, as well as our private chat group on Discord. But more importantly, it'll help us supplement the cost of running this project, the incredible time and energy we put into it 7 days a week, and you'll be giving us some breathing room, not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also to expand Southpaw into other areas. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at patreon.com/southpawpod.
Next, we have the women's flyweight title fight, where champion Valentina Shevchenko stopped Lauren Murphy in round 4. It was an unusually high volume performance from Shevchenko and an unusually low volume performance for Murphy. Jason, let's start with you. Thoughts about this fight?
To start off, I think Valentina Shevchenko gets a little more grief than she probably deserves. I do understand that she's not a super high volume striker, but she hasn't really had to be. And asking her to fight outside of what she does well is very Dana White-esque. And I think he's a fucking idiot. So that's where I'll start it. As I tank my coaching career right then and there.
Not even coaching career. If you ever wanted to get into media, there goes your credentials right there.
Oh yeah. I'm not covering those guys. Never. It's basically just a PR campaign for the unholy evil empire that's become mixed martial arts. Anyway, I digress. Shevchenko does some really great stuff when people come forward, or when people try to feint to draw out her counters. How many times has she hit a real nice spinning back kick when the women that she is competing against try to like stall it out with like to initiate a flinch or a twinge, or to get her to try to you want to fight a counter fighter, like you want to throw them off, start out with some feints and fakes. When they do that and they stand in front of her, she'll spinning back kick you and send you across the cage. So it's not like she's just sitting there killing time either. Like the counter to that is, I think if Valentina started to come forward more often, you would get people just sort of fading back, because I don't think a lot of people want that heat, let alone that smoke. I mean, the woman can fight and fight very well. Yeah, she tends to lull you to sleep at times, but just long enough so that she can actually put you to sleep with a head kick. So that being said, She every once in a while she will bore me, and I do get sort of like the alt-right vibe from her sometimes. So I was really pulling for Murphy, but yeah, Murphy's a tough fighter. She just doesn't have the physical tools or the goods against a fighter who seems to have them all. She's Shevchenko is one of the things, because she's not ridiculously ripped. I think we've had this discussion on other episodes. She's still very strong. You can just see how she controls people from that clinch position. Yeah, she's got great technique with her trips and some of her throws, but how you get into a lot of those hip positions, at least from the body lock position, the 50-50 over under, some of these clinch positions, is from being strong. And you can see that she, against people that look physically more built than she does, she is able to generate that or decrease that distance by generating squeeze with like backs in her posterior chain, and then as soon as she gets like 3 hips in a row, she's sending someone ass over elbows.
One thing I wanted to add was that I think a lot of MMA camps, when they're training their fighters for wrestling and especially defensive wrestling, they are defending against a lot of double legs, which isn't a bad idea because that is going to be the most common entry, even into a clinch. Sometimes you just get in a double leg and then you come up for a clinch. I think on top of strength, a lot of her opponents are not used to somebody who only uses a body lock. Like if it was an arm wrestling contest with Valentina and Jessica Andrade, I don't know if Shevchenko is going to win, but once she had the body lock, it seemed like Andrade didn't know what to do. So I think it's a combination of Shevchenko is stronger than she appears. And secondly, she is very good at a type of wrestling that a lot of her opponents are not prepared for.
Absolutely, it's her hip positioning. She makes up the angle on the hips all the time. She always beats you to 3 hips in a row, and she just kind of sets you back over her knee. And there's something to be said about that technique where positioning is everything. You can make a big throw look great just based on sitting in a chair and popping your hips. And she doesn't even finish hers like that. She just sort of buckles you back and turns. And because you can't really get distance on her, if you try to get your hips back, she's gonna knee in the stomach and it's gonna hurt you because she throws them fast and well placed. And while she's returning that hip to the mat, if you create space, or while she's returning the leg that she knees you with, you're decreasing space because you don't want to be at that distance and take another one. And so she'll go from like a knee strike to finishing that body lock and just kind of dumping you back like it's nothing. And there is a ton of technique involved. At the same time, because whenever she does, and this is why I think her grappling's overrated. When she's on top, she just sort of like pulls you into her and does whatever she wants against really, really well-established grapplers who are high pedigreed. And I think that there is a little bit of a holy shit thing once she grabs a hold of you, which some people that aren't shredded tend to have. And I think she might be one of them. I don't know. I've never grappled her.
Absolutely. I hate to, I try to do less of the, they're built different talk, or, these people from this part of the world are like this, certain things, right? However, there is a bit of that built different, a bit of that factor with Shevchenko. In breaking it down, I completely agree with everything you guys said about the hips, and, to do a little Joe Rogan here. What about those legs? Because, the legs too, of course, play a factor in that. But it is funny, and I just wanted to leave this note, if you guys agree. For me, I kind of compare it with golf, which I guess I dabbled in a little bit and played a little bit of. And one thing that I remember being told to me, and a lot of the things, it's like, one was it taught me a lot about fundamentals, because the person who taught me would say that all these fundamentals that are being taught about the swing, you can actually look and see golfers not do that. And that was kind of my first realization that pros, they don't always do things by fundamentals. They can get away with things. And the other thing that golf taught was that you didn't even have to look at the fundamentals. Sometimes you could just listen to someone, how someone hit a ball, and you could tell how good their form was, right? And I feel like with Shevchenko, especially people who know what they're looking at, I'm sure you guys got this vibe too when she first came on the scene. Just watching her do pads and do basic punch return drills with big gloves with her sister, just hearing the point of contact, the thud that she was making with her shots is just like, that's different. That's going to be tough for a lot of girls to deal with, because a lot of the female fighters, and you still hear them openly admit and suggest and proclaim different strategies. There's still not a unified set on this, much less access, but training partners is some girls go, I train with the guys, so I'm ready for that power. Where other girls are more realistic and understand that even if you're training with guys, you're not going to get that equal playing field. Depending on how the training and the relationship, the training partner, there's a lot of factors in there. Whereas you get a little bit more of an honest assessment, maybe with having some female sample size to go with. There's obviously truth in both. I'm sure there's benefits in both. But what Shevchenko forces these girls is really kind of forces them to answer that kind of question and disparity that I think a lot of the women's division is still trying to work out. And you have technical power, the precision, composure, and all these things in a Shevchenko, and it really forces fighters like Murphy, who otherwise I would tell you is just super underrated and had more of a chance than the odds showed. She almost looked like an even bigger underdog than she was.
When you get thrown by a high amplitude throw, even if you're like a really good grappler, it takes you like 30 seconds to recognize, oh shit, I'm actually good on the ground, right? So like I've gone against people who are like really good wrestlers or really good judokas where I know on the ground I am superior. I will submit them in 2 minutes. But if they throw me, it takes me like a good 30 seconds to a minute to remember, oh yeah, I'm better than them, right? So I think part of that, to Jason's point, is that when she just throws you and makes you feel like an idiot, it takes you a while to mentally recover. And so during that time, Valentina looks really good on the ground and maybe secures a grappling position that maybe even with your better grappling, you can't get out of. Which isn't to say that everybody Valentina is fighting is necessarily better than her on the ground, but I think that's why the parity looks even worse.
I think that's a great point, Sam. I think when you get thrown like that, there is like a neuro disconnect between the brain and the proprioceptors of the body that tell you like where your joints are in space.
You're like, what happened?
Right? And while you're trying to process it in real time, the person on top of you is allowed to punch you in the fucking head, right? Or elbow you in the face. And that's a lot to deal with and make like real time decisions in an instant. So some people are just wired to immediately respond, and they're the type that like wouldn't notice that their arm was cut off in a sword fight. They'd still be swinging it, right? They'd still be swinging on the ground. Guys like Merab, like it'd still be going even when they're out. But the normal person, well, I mean normal, I mean the non-outlier. I'm talking about normal fighters. Even have to take that moment and go, what sent me ass over elbows? Like, I'd rather figure it out for a second so that it never happens again, because there's something very dominant about being thrown. Now, people who have been thrown through, like wrestlers who have been thrown and gone against other world-class wrestlers or even high-level college wrestlers, that's not the first time for it. So, hey, they're always looking to immediately recover because no one wants to get pinned. When you aren't training that on the regular, it takes a while for the brain to catch up.
In Muay Thai as well, and specifically with Valentina in Muay Thai, when I went back to watch her footage, that's something she would do to punctuate rounds. That she would not even just do like the Muay Thai, trips or anything like that. Like she would do straight up like throws, dominant throws, and sometimes even land knee on belly or close to mount, even though it was a Muay Thai fight. And it was, it was strictly just to fuck with her opponent, to show dominance, to kind of show, to your guys' point. And that's something she's done in multiple sports.
Okay, so pattern. What was Shevchenko doing well to make Murphy so passive? And was there anything that was working for Murphy?
Not really, because to Jason's previous point, people do give a lot of grief, and there have been performances mainly up at bantamweight against Nunes that kind of made me pull my hair out, or maybe I thought she could have offered more or pressure to maybe create those counter opportunities. But whether she was pressuring to create them or allowing Murphy to try her best, Murphy was just playing right into her wheelhouse. there essentially wasn't a ton of feints there. And I was kind of worried as well how Murphy would do against southpaws. There wasn't a lot of footage there. She fought Carmouche, but Carmouche went orthodox. And then she lost to Montano in the Tough House in the 2-rounder with not extensive footage on. So it was really tough to tell, especially, but I think it really was problematic because if you look at Murphy, most of her career, she's really from beginning to more evolved Murphy. She still really likes those inside parries and right-handed leads, and she'll finish with, her lead, which is great. Those are all great things. But if you are really used to that, not so much the right-handed lead, that'll work fine, I suppose, with the open stance matchup, obviously. But as far as doing it off of parrying someone's left lead when it's going to be a left power now, I think it could really throw you off. And with not having the footwork and feints, she couldn't really hook off her jab like she's been actually doing much more of, which I thought would have been a better route for her. I wrote my breakdown, that trend. Murphy's got an underrated left hook, and left hook underrated shot against southpaws. But without the proper footwork and just having that speed power feints, she couldn't get in early. And then I think kind of similar to TKZ Ortega without the concussive, well, she probably got some concussive damage too, but not as obvious as like the spinning elbow dynamic shot. One of those hard shots certainly, and I don't mean to say it in a negative derogatory, like fighters are scared. I don't mean it that way, but for lack of better words, one of the shots scared her off. So that became clear. And then we don't really get an honest look. Now we kind of have, again, the mental part of fighting, right? The unspoken part of it. That side was kind of not just won, but open, closed, and shut rounds before the time the fight actually ended. So hard to tell.
Next, we have a middleweight fight between returning Nick Diaz and Robbie Lawler. This was a rematch from a fight they had 17 years ago, which is a testament to how long they've been fighting. Lawler hadn't won a fight in 4 years, and Diaz hadn't fought in 6 years. The fight was moved up from welterweight to middleweight per request from Nick Diaz, which was a bad sign. So were some of the videos coming out. Now, out of good taste, I don't want to break down the fight. What I want to get is a reaction to how the fight ended and Diaz's statements after the fight, because it looked like to me, Diaz took a knee to say he was done. Then he said in the interview, he didn't even know how this fight got set up and implied his management took advantage of him, going back to the manager problems that we talked about earlier with Brian Ortega. Now, if you followed Nick Diaz throughout his career, he's had ups and downs with Cesar Gracie, who was both his trainer and manager. At one point, Gracie was no longer a part of his life after a falling out where Diaz accused Gracie of not knowing how to manage or set up camps and that Gracie was using him. I don't even know if Cesar Gracie was in any of the corners of any of the other members of the Scrap Pack in any of their last fights in the last 5 years. But now it seems like Cesar Gracie is back. So I don't know if Gracie is his manager again or the one that set up this fight, or he's just moral support. I'm just putting that out there. So Dan, as a longtime MMA writer, what did you think about this matchmaking and the way the fight ended, including the interview?
The matchmaking, not so much a problem with it as far as these older fighters go. I'm a fan of having them face fellow elder statesmen. And I know it's easy to say in the lead up and in hindsight that is still, mismatch and that what are we doing? But you think about it in terms of Robbie Lawler's last knockout win was in 2015, which was the last time Nick Diaz fought. It doesn't sound as crazy in those proportions. And I'll spare the No Country for Old Men parallel. I'll just quote that scene between Ellis and Tommy Lee Jones's character. And that's just a great scene that I feel like sums up whatever's going on in Diaz's head and what to make of that. But as far as the ending goes, I feel like it parallels kind of, and especially as you mentioned Gracie, it parallels a lot with what we saw with Ortega and a theme there where there was there's camp turmoil. And say what you will about the Gracie in both camps and corners, right? And perhaps there is some truth to what Nick said, which would make sense. Nick got really big, and sometimes that that family style setup, a restaurant, it's not really set up to go corporate, right? There can be a lot of problems making that transition, but you run through its phase. The business goes bankrupt. It's kind of semi-retired. You have nowhere to go, and you've been partied out, and real people have really used you. Then maybe a guy like Gracie doesn't seem so bad. And going back to your family, he got back into coaching, which really kind of spoke to the maturity. I felt like that was more the real narrative of him getting out of his party phase. It wasn't to come back and fight and be some super fighter again. It feels like we're seeing more Nick Diaz, the coach and the person, which makes more sense of why he was much more realistic. And he's always been honest for people that want to cut through the shtick that's been placed upon him that he doesn't place upon himself. He has always been honest, but he was much more sensible, more mature about it. And the difference between him and Ortega, I felt like it's pretty apropos tying in with the UFC and how they're heavily promoting Hispanic Heritage Month, which is fine. And it makes me, but it always reminds me of the question where I've talked to you about this, Sam, and I've messaged actual UFC fighters to ask them to make sure that I'm not talking out of my ass here, which I'm not. It's always a reminder that like, oh, wow, okay, it's UFC once again completely ignoring Asian Heritage Month, but we're doing all the other ones. Okay. But then part of me wonders, like, maybe it's good that they ignore us, Sam, because like, if you look at like the real bullshit, like, bootstrapping, attitude, like Corazon, it's about hard. It's about, even if you're taking damage, like even before this fight happens, right? Like these are the things they're playing. And Ortega's post-fight speech, and I'm not trying to bring us back there. I'm looping it in to your answer, and I'll pass the baton. But in Ortega's post-fight speech, he's repeating those same, again, kind of like his manager wanted to make sure to push the brand, right? Because that's more important than fighter health. And that bleeds through and seeps through that bootstrap mentality for the fighters, to where Ortega's going, this is what Mexican fighters are about. It's from Corazon, heart. And you know what? I feel like the crowd was cheering just as much for Diaz for making the sensible decision and going, you know what? I'm done. I'm not even going to let anybody else take this from me. I'm going to call it my own self. And as I explained in my podcast, that's one of the few dignities you have, sadly, if you're lucky enough to have that, and take it like Diaz did, and good on him. And I'm happy to say that I don't see a lot of negative stuff toward Diaz. Not that there should be toward making that decision, but I couldn't help think of the parallels between those two stoppages, how we go about them, and how, whether it's through the UFC heritage or the machismo that exists in many societies, just how damaging that can be.
Real quick, what was the Cormac McCarthy "No Country for Old Men" quote?
When did he die?
1909.
Oh, I mean, was it right away or in the night, or when was it?
I believe it was that night. She buried him the next morning, digging in that hard old caliche. What you got ain't nothing new. This country's hard on people. You can't stop what's coming.
I think they realized that, like the quote is, the more time you spent trying to get back what was lost, the more is going out the door. And I think Nick realized that at a certain point. He stepped in, even if he knew he had it coming.
All these heritage months, they're just propaganda to tell the fighters, if you're from this ethnicity, you have to fight till you die. Even like for women, when they're doing some type of thing for women are brave. We're just as strong as men, and we just go out on our shield.
Yeah.
It just becomes a new conduit to promote and push the UFC's, like how Jason likes to talk about it, the swanging and banging, right? Forget the defense, just swang and bang, right?
Oh, I fucking hate it. you know that. I've been biting my tongue for a while. Half of what you get from me is only half of what you get from me, right? The other half I sit on because, again, I still try to make a bit of a living in this industry. So, but yeah, I don't like it.
So, Jason, then what was your reaction to how the fight ended, really, where Nick Diaz took a knee because he knew nobody else was going to save him?
Well, I'll start by saying Dan's reference to "No Country for Old Men" is about as appropriate for the Nick Diaz circumstance that he could have possibly pulled from, because I'm a huge Cormac McCarthy fan, and there's another line. Right, he's outstanding, and especially if you've ever read Blood Meridian and you want to apply any of these philosophies from any of these quotes towards fighting. Another great line from "No Country for Old Men," and this is what I think in the Nick Diaz fight, how it ended is you never know what worse luck your bad luck has saved you from.
Oh shit.
Yeah. That chills. Yeah. That's a great one. Applicable too. Sure. Oh yeah.
And I've met Nick, and I was a huge Nick Diaz hater at first. I owned a portion of Syndicate Mixed Martial Arts with John Wood. Nick Diaz came in, and John and I had some like competing philosophies on how some fighters should train. And when Nick Diaz came in, he said he didn't like what he was seeing from the team. And he thought it was he had some pointed things to say. And then he and I went, and some other people went out for lunch, and we had some great discussions. And those pearls of wisdom you get through relative incoherent lead ups, and I think Sam pointed that out. Like that's how he's been. I owned Syndicate from like in 2015 or 2014. I owned a small portion of it, and I really liked Nick as a human being after that. It took me a little while to come away and become a fan, because I just didn't get it. I didn't get what the complaining after not beating a wrestler, because you're allowed to learn like defensive wrestling in this sport, or there's always boxing, or there's always kickboxing. I didn't see, like, I know jiu-jitsu is your strong point, but you might want to get good at grappling as a whole instead of complaining about it. But the more he took on the almighty machine, the more I like started deleting my old posts on Facebook in case he ever looked at anything, or on Instagram. Like when I was hating, I'm like, delete.
Right.
Because I became a big fan for what he stood for. And when he stayed down, I don't think I've ever been as proud of another human being in a losing effort as I was right there. There was a little bit of ambiguity that I felt, or ambivalence between I felt some sorrow for seeing him lose that way. But at the same time, some pride in the way that he lost. And it was a tough thing to sort of rationalize in my head. So, seeing him take that stand and then have that post-fight interview, it took me from like heartbroken to prideful and proud to heartbroken again. But at the same time, like me looking at my wife and saying, like, this is the sport. Like, this is mixed martial arts. Exploitative, short-sighted, manipulative, no consideration of the long game. No one wants to edify or guide some of these folks early. And this is a legend of the sport having to like save himself from himself because no one else is willing to step up to do it. And then you hear the same tropes, the fighters fight cliche. Well, they do a lot of shit too, man. They pay bills. Fighters struggle. Fighters suffer. Fighters thrive. Fighters are husbands, their wives, their fathers. There's a lot going on there. To reduce it to fighters fight is the closest thing to like that the days of the Romans and that fucking blood sport slavery that had endured then. I hate it. I fucking hate it. Like if your product is Nick Diaz should be duly compensated. And I'm tired of this wouldn't exist to this extent without Dana White. I'm like, guys, you forget that this sport was here before then, right? It was here before then. Now it's hard for me to speak on it without saying some shit that will either get me sued, banned, or beat up, or possibly shot. So I'm just going to stop right here, and I'm gonna transition it back to you guys.
I should take a note from Jason there. I feel like my honesty on things definitely to the point now when I see like certain jobs get filled that like people tell me I'm qualified for, I'm like, that's because I think Black Lives Matter. Okay, I get it. Not obviously direct one-to-one, but I definitely have some opinions that range, and even if they're not crazy, they involve sticking up for human rights and fighters having their portion of the rights as human beings. It still feels like it's met with craziness. So I understand that sentiment there, but I I totally sign off on everything you say for what it's worth, Jason.
And it crushes me because the only way like fighters will thrive is if the fighters themselves are allowed to thrive. And if you want to talk about any kind of trickle down, well, there's a reason why fighters go from camp to camp, or they stay solely with a camp that is sort of like ingrained in the whole like UFC structure. Um, you see winning fighters who go 5, 6, 7, sometimes 10 or 11-0 that jump to a different camp, and the camp hasn't made them better. They just created that opportunity for them. Now, there's a reason why that sort of nepotism exists, and it's so that they can consolidate control. Because if a bunch of individuals from outside your fucking UFC clique got together, then all of a sudden stars that aren't part of your system and your mechanism of control start to work together, and then the power falls on the side of the labor, and they don't want that. So they've been able to consolidate power by consolidating teams and consolidating that access to the UFC, and then predatory contracts like 9-fight deals at 11-11 for fighters on the Ultimate Fighter or whatever they've got. And it's structured as such. I guess it's you can call it smart business or business acumen, but all it is predatory. And if you've ever seen a fighter, and I'll say right now, there's some guys doing commentary, I mean, that are, if you think that it's just awkward because they're dumb, listen to them do commentary 2 and 3 years ago. They were better. There's some cognitive decline. And I'm not even going to say a name or two because everyone's going to jump my shit for it. But there is no concern for them. They're products. They are commodities. They are no longer human beings. And so long as there are eyes on your product, and it can generate sales, that's how they're going to continue to play it. So,
I tweeted this out. Would Nick Diaz have taken this fight? Would he have fought if there was a fighter pension? And everybody was unanimously, no, he wouldn't have fought if he had a pension. And what was interesting is I listened to a Carlos Condit interview recently, post-retirement. Never heard the guy ever talk about unions or fighters organizing or needing to come together to have rights. And now that he's retired, I heard him actually talk about it. I heard him talking about fighter pensions. So it also speaks to your point, Jason, about how constrained they are in the things they could talk about because of the UFC machine. And only when they're out do you hear them talking about this stuff. And we saw an example of that with Nick Diaz, where if there were safety nets like that, a lot of these fighters would never come back.
I really don't think they would. And how many NDAs were they forced to sign so that they can't talk negatively of the UFC? And how much litigation have they been threatened with if they've even sort of alluded to it, or if they had balls enough to just go out and out break it? Like the stress of dealing with cognitive decline because of fight experience, compounded by the stress of bankruptcy because the UFC, the one you spilled blood, the company you spilled blood for, so they could profiteer, is threatening to sue you. Imagine that. Imagine the utter disrespect. Imagine the contempt that would breed. Maybe these fighters feel it. Maybe they don't. Maybe there's some cognitive dissonance there. Maybe there's just some
denial.
Yeah, there's some denial. Or maybe they're holding on to that last bastion or last beacon of hope that there is some potential that they will be brought into the fold. Maybe they'll get like that cush job, or maybe they'll end up on the mic. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But my concern for these athletes, and like it goes beyond just concussive trauma. I've had multiple neck surgeries. I wrestled from the time I was 7 years old. I had disc replacement surgery at 33 before Pennsylvania had even legalized mixed martial arts. And given like the scar tissue and blood flow and the change of the lordotic curve in my spine, I noticed some cognitive decline. And you can see how I sort of struggled with even the word denial. That happens to me every once in a while. I try to do my best, and I've fought. I sparred way too hard for way too long. I've had very few amateur MMA fights because I couldn't get licensed after my second one. I mean, I was already in my mid 30s, and Pennsylvania didn't seem worthy to grant me a license. But that's probably in my best interest, given um, my body was already starting to fall apart. But to combat that. And I haven't been hit in the head nearly as much as anyone else. I think it was more from wrestling. In wrestling, you can have some concussive trauma too, blast doubles over and over, guys heavy on the head, hand fighting, clubbing. But it's not just about concussive trauma from punching. I mean, fighting out of guillotine chokes or getting caught in a triangle, and some of the damage that starts to happen in the cervical spine. That can create some blood flow difficulty, which you're seeing more and more studies come out. And the possibility of that having some long-term and semi-immediate effects on cognitive ability. And you're seeing that in combat sports, the athletes, in grappling, if you consider that a combat sport, and certainly in fight sports as well, especially when you see the reversal of the lordotic curve. And these are things that fighters don't know, let alone understand. And I combated that by getting a master's in marketing, and then I'm finishing up a second master's. I'm finishing up my MBA.
Now, Dan, where do you think this leaves Robbie Lawler?
It's tough because he fought great and it brought it out of him, and he even admitted that himself. But is Robbie, back? I don't think so. But unfortunately, I do worry that if it's big enough, they're going to put him in a fight back to these other fights where they use him as a gatekeeper to build up a guy, and we're just going to see him get washed out with volume and stuff again. So that's kind of my worry there. But again, Robbie, he looked good. He's game. He still has a lot of the athleticism intact. His eyes still look to be there in exchanges. We really saw that with the slipping and rolling that we kind of saw in that first Hendricks fight. We saw a bit of that with the southpaw dynamic. So he was passing a lot of those tests for what it's worth for me. I can't look into his brain, obviously. That's the big question. But I do worry that they're just going to throw him, as UFC tends to reward you when you're victorious. They're going to throw you into some other, even bigger match that maybe you shouldn't be in. So we'll see.
Let's talk about the heavyweight fight between Curtis Blaydes and Jairzinho Rozenstruik, with Blaydes winning a unanimous decision. Let's start with you, Jason. What are the things you like from Blaydes where you're like, this guy can be champion? And what were some of the things that gave you pause where you're like, maybe not?
That's a good question, because the fight in and of itself was a relative dud. Blaydes has a ton of tools. He's big, he's tall, he's strong, he's super athletic. His wrestling is outstanding. I wonder why someone didn't just take Curtis Blaydes and lock him in a boxing gym for 2 years again, and make sure he was like doubly headgeared up so he didn't get too much brain trauma, and teach him really, really how to box and process danger in terms of punches coming at him, and then give him a reprieve for 6 months, and then lock him in a kickboxing or Muay Thai gym for another 2 years, and then say, all right, how about some MMA? So that his wrestling didn't keep him from progressing as a fighter. His wrestling is so good that it's actually made him a worse fighter, because he can win fights by not fighting and solely wrestling. That's no way to improve. Like, winning becomes detrimental to actually improving when you approach it that way. And I think that's where Blaydes is. Like, even if he continues to win, like, he's more flinchy since his knockout to Derek Lewis, and he even shoots with his eyes closed. I think they referenced that in the fight. And you're fighting, and Rozenstruik's supposedly a good striker, but I mean, you'd actually have to strike during the fight for that to unfold, wouldn't you? I mean, he rarely does anymore. He's very, very tentative, and not strategically tentative. Rozenstruik doesn't set up traps, doesn't set traps. He doesn't bait you in. He just sort of like flinches you into thinking, hey man, if you don't do something, I won't do something. And a significant amount of time passes with no action. And as much as I shit on the MMA or the UFC, telling everyone how to fight, like you can't be fan unfriendly and think you're going to have a career in this business,
or win a decision.
right? You're not going to win a decision on your back and like holding someone in that lockdown position and not even attempting to improve. So I think Rozenstruik's time in the UFC is limited. If anyone blames Blades for a boring fight, I mean, they really need to reconsider the onus on Rozenstruik to some extent, because he did very little, and that's not the first time for him.
Now, Dan, you do a lot of film study. Did Blades always close his eyes in his fight, or is this a product of the Lewis KO? Because I don't just mean closing his eyes before he shoots. There were other moments where I caught him just closing his eyes when punches were coming, or just closing his eyes and ducking his head to defend.
Yeah, I don't think it was as bad. I agree with what Jason said. It's more obvious now. Before he would like do stuff like when he ducked, it was changing his level when he would roll off of a cross, which was smart. And I don't know why he really got away from those. It goes well with his double leg sensibilities and getting it on the hips. It's great defensive boxing. And again, it's not something that you're asking. It's not too lofty of a technical task for a heavyweight because he's already shown to have done it. You know, like Jason says, he moves really well. He seems like a guy that you could do that proverbial locking him in the, kickboxing arena for so long and the boxing arena for so forth. But I will say that even though I agree with the criticism on Rozenstruik, I feel like they both could be criticized for the inactivity, but in different ways. And I'm one that usually stands up for a big wrestling grinding fan, a big fan of fighters getting fighters tired, extending the fight. I'm a big proponent of judges to commentary to fans not giving enough credence to grappling work, from advancing to submission attempts, that there needs to be metrics for that. If we have metrics in the individual sports and we're supposed to have judging metrics that incorporates mixed martial arts, why do we have so many for striking and almost virtually none that we don't really credit for grappling? That all being said, at heavyweight, it's a different game where I feel bad, kind of like what Jason said, where like, I don't mean to be like, you need to bang, bro, more aggression with that narrative. But I do feel like it applies more at heavyweight from a general sense, in the sense of the longer you keep someone in a fight, the more dangerous it could be, which was my potential worry and still is my potential worry with the Cyril Gane, right? You can outclass Ngannou. That shouldn't surprise anybody if he does do that. But if you're dancing with Ngannou for a certain period of time and you can't take him down, well, what's going to happen? And this is the reason why I picked Derek Lewis to beat Curtis Blades, not necessarily in the way that he did, but Curtis Blades made me feel less crazy for that pick with the way he fought Rozenstruik, which was essentially like, dude, you're not making hay. You're not making hay by earning these positions. And as you saw, he said that Curtis was like, well, I wanted to fight safe because my eye was closed. Well, I didn't get close to, I believe, the second round, which means you had a decent ground stanza, successful takedown and ground stanza to work before that could have prevented you from that eye hurting, right? And we've seen him dominate guys with strikes and on the ground. He hasn't even had to go to one submission win in his whole career, and we've seen him be dominant. So it's not that he can't do it. It's not that it's not in his style. In his wrestling, you watch his wrestling tape. That was something that got him through. It was just an unbridled aggression. Like every match that I could get my hands on, it was just pure aggression from the guy. So it's not that these things aren't there. I feel like that sometimes fighters, I love when fighters fight more technical, but sometimes this is one of those cases where it can be bad, like you get the wrestler like a Phil Davis learning how to do back foot boxing. It's like, dude, that's not going to connect to your game and what you're good at. And kind of like a Phil Davis, like, dude, Blades actually has some really good mat wrestling and rides and like ways to really kind of finish these fights. And as we saw, it almost becomes a detriment because you get your eyes closed, right? And then, okay, now his what's his mentality? Well, I want to fight safe. Well, no, you just learned the lesson. What, as far as fighting air quote safe and heavyweight does for you. You need to make hay with his position and get this dude out of here. He's already proven with his low volume mass how dangerous he is, even with not throwing anything. Get him out of there. We don't need this to be a longer night. You're going to be in 5-round fights with your division being weak. So it's going to be even more of a problem if you don't get these guys out of here. So it sounds contradictory to most of my opinions, but I do feel like Blades needs to be more aggressive when he gets to these positions.
Yeah, you need to be offensive to be defensively responsible. Otherwise, eventually they're going to start hitting you and you're going to get hurt. Jason, Is closing your eyes something a fighter can fix?
I've seen it. I've seen it early in a fighter's career. I had a kid who was ex-military, who I didn't think would ever fight for me. His name was Jim Rendero. He was good friends with Felder, and he would close his eyes and turn his back, and we didn't know why. It was just instinctual. And the kid was tough, and he was like a grizzled vet, but just closed his eyes. And he had one or two fights with me, and we had falling out, and he went a different direction. And I think he fought 3 or 4 times after that, and he won them all. And I watched his fights, and he looked great. Like, he became more competent. He ended up, I think he ended up losing to Randy Brown in an amateur fight, and he just got mauled. I mean, he got hit with everything, and he did not blink. He did not flinch. He didn't run away. So yeah, that's a guy who's only 4 or 5 fights deep into an amateur career.
Very early.
Yeah, at this stage of the game, this advanced stage against like top tier competition, I don't know. I wouldn't think if you're closing your eyes on your double legs, that's a concern. You know, I mean, you've wrestled your whole life. I don't know if instinctually anyone who competes in wrestling at a high level closes their eyes on their shots. So it's got to be sort of an override for the natural inclination to penetrate, shoot to the hips, finish, to now start closing your eyes. I think there's some sort of, like, I don't know, fear or protective component that there's sort of a glitch that's keeping them from, competing optimally with eyes open.
And maybe it's a temporary thing because he fought Ngannou twice and got stopped, and he fought Derek Lewis and got stopped, which very few people can survive those type of stoppages. So maybe it's not something he always had, and he's developed it, and maybe over time he'll just get over it. But in this fight, even with Rosenstrike's low volume, like with the knee or some of the other shots, it looked like Blaze was actually doing better than him striking wise. But the only reason he got hit with those things is because he got caught in those moments where he was closing his eyes anyway. So it's almost like he couldn't see because his eye got closed up. But the reason why his eye got closed up was because he was closing his eyes and he couldn't see those strikes coming. So it became kind of a vicious cycle, which hopefully he can get over going forward.
Well, I'll say this real quick. If there's anyone that can sort of punch you into feeling gun shy, it's going to be guys like Ngannou and Derek Lewis. If that's going to happen, the results of those 3 fights against those 2 men, that'll do it, and that'll do it to anybody.
Yeah.
Yep.
That'll put the fear of God in you.
Yep.
All right. Thank you both for coming on the show and spending time with us. Dan, where can people find you, follow you, support you?
I'll keep it simple. At Dan Tom MMA on Twitter is probably the only socials I'm really active on. And most of my stuff's all reposted through there. So you can just find me there, and just want to say this has been awesome chatting with both of you. This was really awesome.
Appreciate it. Jason, give us your social media.
I'm on almost all social media channels. I mean, I don't know what all of them are anymore, but I'm on 3. Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I believe I'm the only Jason Sargus available, so it's not hard to find me. I might start a website called everyonehatessargus.com. Gentlemen, it was an absolute pleasure. Dan, big fan, always a pleasure. To Sam, you know that. Had a blast, guys. I really appreciate your time.
Fan of both of you guys and a fan of Southpaw.
Oh, yeah. Subscribe.
Thanks for listening to Fight Study. Make sure to check out all of our other shows. Tell all your socially conscious friends about us. Support us on Patreon and get extra bonus content. But more than that, support us to help us keep this outlet going. Thanks for listening.